Welcome to When Gen X Ruled the Multiplex, the films that shaped the MTV generation. I can say without hyperbole that no film has shaped me as much as today's pick, my all-time favorite film, the 1988 anime cyberpunk classic, Akira. Akira was directed by Katsuhiro Otomo and was co-written by Otomo and Izu Hashimoto. It was based on Otomo's long-running manga series of the same name, which began in 1982 and was serialized weekly in Young magazine. At the time of its release, Akira was the most expensive anime film of all time, with a budget roughly equivalent to $5.5 million. It was a huge success worldwide on home video, but it also briefly made it into US theaters in 1989 and 1990. Streamline Pictures, the American distributor, had two English-dubbed 35mm prints, which made their way to art house theaters across the country. The Magic Lantern Theater in Spokane, Washington, managed to get a hold of one of those two prints for a few days in June of 1990, and I managed to see it when I was 16, and it changed my frickin' life. In 1988, Tokyo is obliterated by what we initially assume is an atomic blast. 31 years later, in 2019, a sprawling neon metropolis known as Neo-Tokyo has been rebuilt from the ruins. Neo-Tokyo is unstable and violent, with non-stop terrorist attacks and civil unrest in protest against a corrupt government and a repressive military presence. In a dive bar known as the Harukiya, a juvenile delinquent named Yamagata tells his friend Kaneda, the leader of a teen biker gang, that they've cornered a rival gang known as the Clowns. Kaneda is the proud owner of the most ridiculously cool motorcycle ever, which his best friend Tetsuo, who is small and weak, covets. Pretty much every detail from Akira has made it into pop culture legend, but Kaneda's bike is especially famous. For example, that bike made a cameo in Steven Spielberg's Ready Player One. Kaneda, Tetsuo, and Yamagata take off through the streets of Neo-Tokyo in pursuit of the clowns in a violent and dazzling chase sequence, and if you're not already madly in love with the film by this point, I'm not sure we can be friends. Akira is made up of hand-drawn and hand-painted animation cells. Akira was shot at the standard 24 frames per second, and while most animation will use 8 or 12 cells within those 24 frames, Akira uses a full 24 different frames per second, with up to 8 or 9 layers of cells in each frame. The Akira production team employed thousands of artists to draw and paint all those thousands upon thousands of cells, and the end result is like nothing you've seen before. Adding to the complexity is that the voice actors recorded their dialogue before those thousands upon thousands of cells were ever drawn, so that the animation could precisely match their mouth movements. This is almost never done because it's a freakishly daunting amount of work. When you watch most animation, even very well done animation, your brain adjusts to the idea that the animated mouth movements don't really match up with the dialogue. If you watch the original Japanese language of Akira, though, the mouth movements match up with the dialogue flawlessly, and it's startling what a difference that makes. That's one of the reasons why Akira is a notoriously difficult film to dub into other languages. The first time I watched it, I saw the much maligned Streamline Pictures dub, which has some iffy translations. In 2001, Pioneer Entertainment came up with a completely different English language dub for their DVD release. Both dubs are fine, you'll get a good viewing experience with either one. But still, for the full Akira experience, if you can, it's best to watch it in the original Japanese. While televisions broadcast news reports about the violent unrest that's rocking the city, an unnamed terrorist is chased on foot by the police. He's accompanied by Takashi, who appears to be a prematurely aged small boy. As protesters clash with the police, the terrorist is surrounded by heavily armed policemen who riddle him with bullets. Takashi absolutely flips out at this and has a psychic meltdown where he telekinetically shatters windows. Meanwhile, Kaneda's gang and the clowns are creating all kinds of chaos in the streets of Neo-Tokyo. When Tetsuo takes off on his own after a clown, he ends up colliding violently with Takashi. When Kaneda and the rest of his gang arrive, they find an injured Tetsuo being hauled off in a military helicopter under the command of the imposing Colonel Shikishima. Kaneda and his gang are placed under arrest. Takashi is confronted by Masaru, another apparently prematurely aged child, who convinces him to return with him and the colonel. The slain terrorist had taken Takashi from a military-run medical center where he exists as a perpetual test subject for psychic experiments. At the police station, the police interrogate suspects, looking for the culprits behind the various terrorist attacks. They correctly determine that Kaneda and his friends are not smart enough to be the culprits behind anything, and they release them from custody. Kaneda spots a foxy young terrorist named Kei and becomes instantly horny for her. He secures her release by convincing the cops she's a member of his gang. The colonel, along with Dr. Onishi, oversees a parliament-sanctioned program of psychic experiments on various test subjects. It's never expressly stated, but because the military is involved, it's fair to assume the test subjects are being weaponized. Tetsuo, whose own strong psychic energy has been awakened due to his contact with Takashi, has unwillingly become their newest test subject. The doctor observes to the colonel that Tetsuo's energy pattern is very similar to one that belonged to a former test subject named Akira. At their hilariously terrible school, Kaneda and his friends meet up with their joyously trashy girlfriends. Tetsuo's sweet and shy girlfriend Kaori is worried about her injured and missing boyfriend. Kaneda is worried about Tetsuo as well, though he tries to hide it. Tetsuo escapes from the medical center and finds Kaori. They run away together on Kaneda's bike, but they're ambushed by vengeful members of the Clowns. Kaneda, along with Yamagata and another young gang member named Kai, comes to their rescue. Tetsuo is sick of being weak and sick of always needing to be saved by Kaneda. He has an angry breakdown, compounded by the drugs the doctors have shot him up with, and he begins hallucinating about Neo-Tokyo being destroyed and his insides falling right out of his body. The colonel arrives mid-breakdown and hauls Tetsuo back into custody. While Kaneda, Yamagata, and Kai are out with their girlfriends at a shopping promenade, they're caught up in another terrorist explosion. Kaneda spots Kei fleeing the scene and heads after her. He trails her into the sewers and saves her from the police, and she takes him to her secret lair. Her fellow terrorists, who are headed up by a man named Ryu, consider killing Kaneda because he may be a spy. They ultimately conclude, accurately, that Kaneda is not smart enough to be a spy. Kaneda is a delightful and utterly hilarious character, and he's super good in tight situations, but his brains are made of marshmallow fluff. The terrorists plan to sneak into the medical center to gather information about the newest test subject, Tetsuo, and Kaneda convinces them to bring him with them. We meet a third prematurely aged child, Kyoko, who tells the colonel about premonitions she's been having about Akira returning and the city being destroyed like it was in 1988. Takashi, Masaru, and Kyoko are not really children, by the way. They're adults who were psychic test subjects as children in the 1980s, along with the still unseen Akira. As a result of the drugs and the experiments conducted on them, they haven't aged properly. They still seem more like children than adults, and at the medical center, they're kept in a giant nursery surrounded by stuffed animals and toys. The colonel visits the under-construction Olympic Stadium, because in a weird bit of precognition from this film made in 1988, Tokyo is the site of the upcoming 2020 Olympic Games. Underneath the stadium, behind multiple layers of heavy-duty security, lies a cryogenic vault labeled with Akira's name. From a conversation between the colonel and the doctor, we learned that Akira was responsible for the destruction of Tokyo 31 years ago. At the medical center, Takashi, Kyoko, and Masaru, who are frightened of Kyoko's premonition that Tetsuo will awaken Akira, inflict terrifying hallucinations of gigantic, menacing stuffed animals on a freaked-out Tetsuo. Tetsuo uses his new psychic powers to break out of his room. When a doctor and various armed guards try to stop him, he psychically slaughters them all, effortlessly and messily. And this is right around the time it starts to dawn on viewers that Tetsuo is not a very good person. He heads to the nursery, taking out dozens of guards in riot gear along the way. In the nursery, he battles Takashi, Masaru, and Kyoko. Kyoko tries to warn him of the dangers of his powers, and from her, he learns about Akira. Akira's soundtrack, by the way, is performed by the Geino Yamashiro Gumi, which is a music collective that combines traditional Japanese music styles with modern technology. The music of Akira is extremely cool and striking, and extremely memorable. If you've seen Akira, Tetsuo's theme is probably running through your head right now just from seeing these images. If you ever want to make an average day seem very dramatic and monumental, I highly recommend blasting the Akira soundtrack as you go about your daily business. Kaneda, Kei, and the terrorists infiltrate the medical center and get into a shootout with the guards, which culminates with Kaneda and Kei commandeering some kind of flying vehicle. Kyoko communicates psychically with Kei and leads them to the nursery. They emerge into chaos. Kaneda has some kind of noble yet muddled idea about rescuing Tetsuo, and discovers that Tetsuo needs no rescuing, and in fact is behaving like a giant murderous dick. Tetsuo mocks Kaneda because their positions have effectively been reversed, and then he heads to the Olympic Stadium to free Akira. The colonel takes Kaneda and Kei into custody. In their prison cell, Kei, who is once more under Kyoko's psychic control, explains to Kaneda that Akira is an evolutionary mistake. He consists of pure uncontrolled energy that devours everything in its path. Kyoko frees Kaneda and Kei so they can stop Tetsuo from releasing Akira. On his way to the Olympic Stadium, Tetsuo makes a pit stop at the Harukiya for drugs to keep his powers under control, and ends up murdering the bartender. When Yamagata and Kai arrive, Yamagata challenges Tetsuo to a fight, and Tetsuo murders him as well. Kaneda and Kei hook up with a distraught Kai, who tells them about Yamagata's death, before Kyoko once again psychically possesses Kei to use her to battle Tetsuo. As the military tries to cordon off the city to apprehend Tetsuo, Neo-Tokyo spirals out of control with riots and unrest. Tetsuo, who manages to acquire himself a snazzy red cloak on his way to the Olympic Stadium, easily destroys everyone in his path. Adding another dimension to the chaos, anti-science religious fanatics hail Tetsuo as the second coming of Akira and welcome the impending destruction of the city. There are also whole plot lines about military coups and murderous betrayals in parliament that I am glossing right over because there is just so much story to get through. Tetsuo reaches the Olympic Stadium. Before he can open the cryogenic vault, he's challenged by Kyoko in Kei's body, who warns him that he won't be able to control Akira's power. Tetsuo defeats Kei and frees Akira, who turns out to be a bunch of medical specimen jars containing the organs of a child's dissected corpse. Kaneda makes it to the stadium and confronts Tetsuo, and they have an acrimonious reunion during which they try their very best to murder each other in a lot of wildly entertaining ways. The Colonel orders an attack on Tetsuo via satellite, which ends with Tetsuo losing an arm before flying up to space to personally kick that satellite's ass. Tetsuo fashions a new arm out of scrap metal. The drugs that allow him some control over his ability wear off, and when the Colonel tries to convince Tetsuo to return to the medical center with him, his metal arm explodes into a monstrous mass of metal tentacles. And then his whole body explodes into a gigantic, gross, bloated mass. Kaori arrives at the Olympic Stadium wanting to help her boyfriend, and he accidentally sucks her up into the exploding folds of his body and crushes her to death. Realizing it's the only way to stop Tetsuo, Kyoko, Masaru, and Takashi shatter the specimen jars and psychically reassemble their old friend Akira. Akira, who exists as pure uncontrolled energy, promptly wipes out everything in his path. Tetsuo is sucked into Akira's energy vortex. He calls out to Kaneda for help, and even though they've spent most of the film trying to kill each other, Kaneda enters the energy vortex to save his best friend. Takashi, Masaru, and Kyoko enter the vortex as well to save Kaneda, even though it will likely mean their doom. He drifts through memories of his childhood and his friendship with Tetsuo, along with the collective memories of Takashi, Masaru, Kyoko, and Akira. Kyoko explains to Kaneda that they summoned Akira to take Tetsuo away for the time being until his power can be controlled. The vortex of energy collapses into a speck of light, and Kaneda awakens unharmed, with Kei desperately searching for him. Kaneda and Kei, joined by Kai, ride off on his ruined bike, while somewhere in a plane of existence beyond human comprehension, Tetsuo announces his presence. Akira's power, and the way the powers that be that run Neo-Tokyo choose to handle it, is a pretty clear metaphor for the way the world has chosen to handle its entrance into the atomic age. Japan knows better than any other country the devastating dangers of nuclear power, and that knowledge infuses much of their pop culture, particularly their anime, and it's certainly at the core of Akira. Atomic power is a Pandora's box that we've opened, and in many ways it's a marvelous thing. Nuclear energy is a tremendously powerful and relatively clean energy source with low carbon emissions, and if handled correctly, we can do marvelous things with it. It's not at all clear we can handle it correctly. When we entered the atomic age, it meant Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the nuclear arms race and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and the Fukushima reactor meltdown and all the other disasters and meltdowns that have dotted our modern era. But that's the thing with Pandora's box. Once it's opened, it can't be closed. Neo-Tokyo tried to close Pandora's box by storing Akira's remains under the Olympic Stadium, and while the film isn't necessarily saying that was the wrong course of action, at best, it delayed the inevitable. At worst, it's probably at the core of why Neo-Tokyo is such a seething, stagnant disaster of a city. At one point, a character compares the city to a rotting fruit, and that rot is because Neo-Tokyo has deliberately repressed the evolutionary step that Akira and later Tetsuo represent. But at the climax of the film, when that step is taken, Neo-Tokyo is devastated with what is surely immense loss of life. We're left not knowing what this next stage of evolution really means. The film doesn't tip its hand as to whether we should interpret the ending as a good or bad thing. Akira is an overwhelming sensory overload, particularly the first time you see it. It's hard to believe a single film can pack so much gonzo energy into it every single second. It has a complicated plot. It boils down a complex, multi-year, multi-volume manga series into 2 hours. And while there's a lot that was cut out, an awful lot made it in. This is a film that goes off in all directions, and there are a lot of major characters, each with their own storyline. You're not going to follow it all on the first viewing, but Akira can be boiled down to the very sturdy and emotionally satisfying story at its core of Kaneda and Tetsuo, best friends who would die for each other and who also spend most of the film trying their very best to kill each other. When I first saw Akira on that June day in 1990, anime hadn't yet made much of an impact on these shores. My anime experience was pretty much limited to those dodgy yet entertaining Americanized versions of Japanese cartoons that aired in syndication on US television. Voltron and Saber Rider and Robotech and maybe some old school Speed Racer thrown in the mix. I loved all those shows, but obviously Akira is on a whole other level. I spent those 2 hours in the theater in giddy hysterical giggles, because Akira is often hilarious. And then I spent the rest of the evening feeling like I could blow up street lamps with the power of my mind. It's a mood-changing film. No matter how many times I've seen it, it still gives me that intoxicating energy surge. I then spent 4 years at USC's film school writing screenplays that were each in some way inspired by Akira. None of them ever sold, which was probably for the best. Akira is tricky to imitate, though many have tried. In the 30-plus years since its release, various Hollywood live-action remakes have been greenlit, entered pre-production, and ultimately sputtered out. There was about a 15-year stretch around the turn of the millennium where nothing could cause me greater anxiety than a fresh crop of Akira remake rumors. At one point, Justin Timberlake was rumored to be cast as Kaneda, and Robert Pattinson was set to play Tetsuo, and Keanu Reeves was somehow involved. These are all entertaining and likable performers, but by the time you're thinking Timberlake would make a good Kaneda, it's a sign your remake is drifting pretty far afield from the source material. I try to keep an open mind, but it seems like nothing about Akira could be improved with a live-action remake. Akira's ridiculously high production values means it exists in a category of its own, and any remake, no matter how well intended, is going to suffer by comparison. Next time, we are going to Saturday Morning Detention with Claire, Allison, Bender, and the other members of the Breakfast Club. Thank you for joining me here today. I hope to see you then.